The Bean Trees by Barbara Kingsolver. Chapter 2. New Year's Pig. Luann Ruiz lived in Tucson, but thought of herself as just an ordinary Kentuckian a long way from home. She had acquired her foreign last name from her husband, Angel. As it turned out, this was the only part of him that would remain with her. He left on Halloween. 3 years before, on Christmas Day, Angel had had a bad accident in his pickup truck. It left him with an artificial leg below the knee and something else that was harder to pin down. Luann often would get the feeling he didn't really like her, or anyone else for that matter. He blamed people for things beyond their control. Luann was now pregnant with her first, which was due in 2 months. She hoped more than anything that it wouldn't be born on Christmas Day. She had been thinking about herself and Angel splitting up for even longer than she had been pregnant, but she didn't particularly do anything about it. That was Luann's method. She expected that a divorce would just develop, like a pregnancy, that eventually they would reach some kind of agreement without having to discuss it. This isn't how it worked out. When she began to turn away from him in bed at night and to get up quietly in the mornings to cook his eggs, Angel seemed to accept this. Possibly he thought she was worried about the baby. Later, when the arguments resumed, they had a hopeless quality that Luann had not experienced before. The arguments made her feel that her bones were made of something like the rubber in a Gumby doll, that her body could be bent into any shape and would stay that way. She would sit at the kitchen table tracing her fingers over the artificial knots in the wood-look Formica tabletop while Angel paced back and forth and accused her of thinking he wasn't good enough. He listed names of people, mostly friends of his she could barely remember having met, and asked her if she had slept with them, or if she had wanted to. Angel limped so slightly it was barely noticeable, but there was just the faintest jingling sound with every other step. It was probably something he could have gotten adjusted if he hadn't been too proud to take it into the prosthetic shop. No matter how loud his voice became, Luann could still hear the jingle. She could never think of anything to say that would change the course of these arguments, and so they went on and on. Once, several years before, she had become so frustrated with Angel that she threw a package of bologna at him. They both laughed, and it ended the argument. Now she didn't have the strength to get up and open the refrigerator. Finally, he had said it was because of his leg, and no matter what she said, he wouldn't hear it any other way. She more or less gave up talking, and when she lay on her back at night, she felt it was the guilt weighing down on her aching spine instead of the baby. She could remember wheeling him down the white corridor at the hospital to bring him home, just 2.5 weeks after the accident. She had felt filled up and proud. Everything she loved in the world was in that chair. Having nearly lost Angel made him all the more precious. One of the doctors said that his boot had probably saved his life, and she felt like kissing it, although in all the confusion no one knew exactly where it had ended up. The boot had caught on the door frame, causing him to be dragged several hundred yards along with the truck as it spun into an irrigation ditch along Highway 86 west of Tucson. The damage to the truck was surprisingly minor. There was a bottle of Jim Beam in the cab that wasn't even broken. He lost his leg because of being twisted and dragged, but the doctor said if he had been thrown from the vehicle at such a high speed, he would have died instantly. It crossed Luann's mind that he might have just been saying this because Angel was so upset about losing a leg, but she decided it would be best to take the doctor's word for it. When he came home, Luann gave up her part-time job at the Three Bears Day School to be with him, insisting that they would get along fine on his disability pay until he was able to go back to work at the bottling plant. She spent weeks playing gin rummy with Angel on the bed and running out to Lee Sing's market to get whatever he wanted. She loved the way he asked for things specifically, like Mrs. Smith's pound cake or a beefaroni. She wouldn't have guessed Angel had even noticed the things that came in different brand names, other than beer. It was their best time together. Never at any time was Luann repulsed by the amputation. After his stump had healed, it did not bother her to touch it, which Angel himself would never do. It had a smooth, defenseless look to it that reminded her of a penis, something she had always thought seemed out of place on a man's body. When he got the prosthesis, she was fascinated at first by the way it was put together, and then thought nothing of it at all. It was something that lay on the floor by his side of the bed at night, while the cat, Snowboots, lay curled up by hers. It took Angel some time to get used to the new leg, but in the long run, there was very little he couldn't do with it, except that he was no longer able to wear cowboy boots. For some reason, the ankle hinges were not flexible enough to fit into a boot. Other than this, Luann could never see why the accident needed to change his life at all. He hadn't been a cowboy for years, anyway. On the Friday Angel left, he had long since gone back to work. He probably didn't think about it being Halloween, only that it was payday. Luann didn't think of any of this, of course, since she had no idea that it was the particular day her husband had decided to leave her. Luann was in Dr. Pelinowski's waiting room, waiting for her 7-month prenatal exam. She had a magazine on her lap, or what was left of her lap, but preferred to stare instead at an enormous wall calendar that showed all the months at once. She was anxious about her child's birthday. Christmas had been difficult for Angel and Luann since the accident, naturally, and they had just about stopped celebrating it altogether. Having a baby on that day would just be a reminder, and besides, she had read in McCall's that children with Christmas birthdays often feel cheated out of having their own special day. Luann thought that being born the day after, when everybody is fed up with celebrating, would just be that much worse. She decided to ask the doctor if there was some way to make sure the baby would come before Christmas, although she was pretty sure that there wasn't. Dr. Pelinowski's nurse seemed to like him and called him Dr. P. Luann thought this was a hoot because he was OB-GYN, a maternity doctor, which all starts when you bring in a jar of pee. She had to keep from laughing out loud whenever she heard the nurses call out over the intercom, "Dr. P! Dr. P!" A nurse with crispy-looking white hair and a lavender pantsuit came out and called Luann's name. She called her Mrs. Angel Ruiz. Angel could always correct Anglos when they pronounced his name wrong. "Angel," he would say, "I'm not a damn baseball team." But Luann rarely corrected anybody on anything. Her mother, Mrs. Logan, still pronounced neither Angel's first name nor their last name correctly, saying it something like ruins. She hadn't wanted Luann to marry Angel in the first place, but for the wrong reasons. She disliked him because he was Mexican, which didn't make the slightest difference to Luann. In Tucson, she tried to explain to her mother, there were so many Mexicans that people didn't think of them as a foreign race. They were doctors, bank clerks, TV personalities, and even owned hotels. You can see them any day of the week eating in a Black Angus steakhouse, she told her mother. Mrs. Logan, who lived in eastern Kentucky and had never seen a Mexican, thought Luann was making this up. When Dr. Pelinowski examined her, he warned again that she was gaining too much weight. Originally, he had thought it might be twins, but now they knew for sure it was just Luann and the baby. This time, he was warning about her weight was more severe. For Luann, who had always been practically underweight according to the doctor's office charts, it was impossible to imagine she wouldn't be exactly the same after it was all over. But she had to admit the baby made her want to eat constantly. She told Dr. Pelinowski that it's hard when you're in the kitchen cooking for someone all the time. He told her to put her husband on a diet too. He meant it as a joke. On her way out, the nurse gave her a pamphlet with a special diet written out in both English and Spanish. She thought about asking for a second copy to send to her mother. After 4 years, Luann still felt that she had to prove her point about Mexicans, and so she would send clippings from the newspaper when they were promoted to company vice presidents and such. Luann realized, though, that this pamphlet didn't fall into that category. Her mother was no doubt already convinced that Mexicans had babies like anyone else. In fact, she had told Luann that from what she heard, they had too many, that they were trying to take over the world like the Catholics. Luann hadn't yet broken the news that when the baby was born, the plan was to give it a Catholic baptism. This would be for the sake of Angel's mother, who frequently claimed to be dying from any one of various causes. The only English words she knew were the names of diseases. Luann made the baptism decision purely for practical reasons. If one of the grandmothers was going to have a conniption, it might as well be the one who was 1,800 miles away rather than the one who lived right across town. Luann looked over the pamphlet while she waited for the bus. Like most of the other literature she had received, it had a picture on the front of a mother holding a baby. Sometimes the women in the pictures were white, sometimes Mexican, and sometimes black. They were shown holding their babies in various positions, but they were never shown as pregnant. Luann wondered about this, since all the pamphlets were about prenatal care. On the bus, she decided it must have to do with the fact that the pamphlets were put together by men, who, in her opinion, liked the looks of a mother and baby better than a pregnant woman. She was fairly sure about this. On the bus, for instance, several men would stand up to offer her a seat, but they wouldn't quite look at her. The high school boys didn't make remarks under their breath or try to rub up against her when the bus made sudden stops and turns. To be able to relax this way on a crowded bus was a new experience for Luann, and she thought that in some ways it would not be so bad to go through your life as a pregnant lady. She watched the houses and telephone poles go sailing by. Some of the telephone poles had advertisements like Tania Maria, a woman leaning forward in a loose sweater and spiky heels. She was a singer and had enough hair for at least 2 people. Other telephone poles had black posters with letters that appeared to be cut out of a newspaper, like the ransom notes in mystery novels. But they were ads for brands with names like Audio Confusion and Useful Turmoil and The Meat Puppets. She thought of naming her baby Tania Maria. Angel would suggest naming it something like Meat Puppet. That would be his idea of a joke. It was pure pleasure not to have men pushing into her and touching her on the bus. It allowed her mind to drift far away from her strange, enormous body. When she was 9, her grandfather Ormsby had given her a jackknife and had told her that for safety's sake she should always keep a magic circle around her when she used it. She would sit in the backyard and draw a circle in the dirt that no one could come into while she whittled for hours and hours on thick brown bars of soap. The jackknife was long gone now, but once again there was something like a magic circle around her. She got off at the Roosevelt Park stop, which was half a block from the park itself. Sprawled over the large corner lot was a place called Jesus is Lord Used Tires. You couldn't make a mistake about the name. It was painted in big, cramped blue letters over the door, with periods inserted between the words. Jesus is Lord Used Tires. On the side of the pleated tin building, there was a large picture of Jesus, with outstretched hands and yellow streamers of light emanating from his head. There was also a white wall tire, perhaps added to the mural as an afterthought and probably meant to have no direct connection with the Lord, but it hung in the air below, his left hand very much like a large yo-yo. Jesus appeared to be on the verge of performing an around the world or some other fancy trick. Top-heavy, chin-high stacks of Firestones and Michelins at the edge of the paved lot formed a wall between Jesus' Lord and a combination nightclub and pornography shop next door called Fanny Heaven. There was no mistaking this place either. The front windows were whitewashed, and large signs painted over them declared "Girls, Girls, Girls" on one side of the door and "Total Nudity" on the other. On the front door of Fanny Heaven was a life-size likeness of a woman with long red hair and a leopard skin bikini. Public art of various types was popular on this block. Luann walked past both of these establishments nearly every day. Something about the Jesus is Lord place reminded her of Kentucky, and she always meant to ask, if she only had the nerve, if the people there came from her part of the country. Fanny Heaven she just tried to ignore. There was something innocent and primitive about the painting on the door, as though the leopard bikini lady might have been painted by a schoolchild, except she was positioned in such a way that the door handle, when a person pushed it, would sink into her crotch. This door always gave Luann the shivers, though she tried not to give it a second thought. She rounded the corner and stopped to do some grocery shopping at the Lee Sing Market, which faced the park directly across from where she and Angel lived. She bought most of the items recommended by the diet pamphlet, but some of them, like yogurt, were too expensive. She bought a package of macaroons because they were Angel's favorite. The Chinese woman at the cash register was Li Xing. Her mother, who was said to be more than 100 years old, lived with her in the back of the store. Li Xing told Luann she was going to have a girl. "She's high, up here," Li Xing said, tapping her bony fist above her stomach. She said this to Luann every time she came in. "Either way is okay with me," Luann said, although she was somewhat curious to see if Li Xing would be right. Li Xing shook her head as she rang the cash register and muttered something that sounded to Luann like New Year pig. "Beg your pardon?" Luann was a little afraid of Li Xing, who often said peculiar things like this. "Feeding a girl is like feeding the neighbor's New Year pig. All that work. In the end, it goes to some other family." Luann felt offended, but didn't really know how to answer. She was a long way from her own family in Kentucky, but she didn't see this as being entirely her fault, and it wasn't as if her brother had stuck any closer to home either. He had gone north to work on the Alaskan pipeline and had married a Canadian dog trainer. They had 4 daughters with Eskimo names that Luann couldn't keep straight, things that sounded like Chinook and Winnebago. Outside, it was beginning to get dark. Luann crossed the park in a hurry, skirting around an old wooden trellis where several transients were congregating. As usual, she tried to concentrate on not being afraid. Angel had told her that some people, like dogs, can smell fear. When she got home, she saw that Angel had already been home from work and had left again, for good. She was confused at first and thought they had been robbed until she began to see a pattern to what was taken. She wandered around the house with her grocery bag looking at the half-empty house. After 4 years, there was very little, other than clothes, that she thought of as belonging clearly to one or the other. In a strange way, she was fascinated to see what he had claimed for his own. It revealed more to her about his personality, she thought, than she had learned during their whole marriage. He left all of the sheets and blankets, the knickknacks, and all the kitchen things except for 3 matching beer mugs. He had taken some of the old magazines and paperback mysteries from the shelf. She didn't miss the books so much as she was hurt by the ugly empty spaces left behind, like missing teeth, the books on either side falling and crowding into the gaps. Gone from the bedroom was a picture of Angel taken at a rodeo in 1978. In the picture, he was sitting on top of a bull named S.O.B., which was supposed to be the meanest bull in the history of rodeo. In the entire year of 1978, only one rider had stayed on S.O.B. for 8 seconds. Angel wasn't the one. At the time of this particular photo, the animal was doped up on PCP, which the roadies used to drug the bulls and horses when they moved them around. PCP was common as dirt in that line of work. Angel's rodeo name had been Dusty, which was short for angel dust. He also had taken one clean towel, the only tube of toothpaste, and the TV. Luann had forgotten it was Halloween and was completely bewildered when a mob of children came to the door. She was frightened by their dark, darting pupils peering through the little holes in their bright plastic masks. She knew they were neighborhood children she had seen 1,000 times, but their costumes she couldn't tell who they were. To calm herself down, she talked to them and tried to guess whether each one was a boy or a girl. She guessed correctly on the princess, the green-faced witch, Frankenstein, and the Incredible Hulk, also green. The extraterrestrial she got wrong. Now she remembered why she had needed to go to the Li Xing market. She didn't have any candy to give out. She considered giving them pieces of fruit or macaroons, but this would be a waste of money. Their mothers would probably go through their bags and throw things like that away, fearing cyanide and razor blades. On television, they said everything should be sealed in the original wrapper. The children seemed to feel sorry for her, but were growing impatient. They expected adults to be prepared. "You better give us something, or we'll have to soap your windows, Miss Ruiz," the extraterrestrial said half-heartedly. Luann decided to go and shake out the Mickey Mouse Bank, in which she had been saving pennies to buy a washing machine for the baby's diapers. Angel had laughed at her, saying the baby would have kids of its own before she could save that many pennies. The children seemed satisfied with the pennies and went away. She left Mickey by the door so she would be better organized for the next round. By 11 o'clock, Luann's feet were killing her. She could feel her heartbeat in her ankles. For 3 or 4 weeks, Luann's feet had been so swollen that she could only wear one particular pair of shoes, which had a strap across the ankle, and now she was going to have to go to bed with those shoes on. She couldn't bend over far enough to unbuckle the straps, and Angel was not there to do it for her. If she had thought of it, she might have asked the last bunch of trick-or-treat kids to do it, but it was now too late. As she was getting ready for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and thought she looked disgusting and pornographic in her nightgown and pantyhose and shoes, like someone who would work at Fanny Heaven, though of course they wouldn't have pregnant women there. Still, the thought upset her. She turned out the light, but kept listening for sounds that might be more kids coming to the door, or might be Angel changing his mind, coming home. In her other ear, pressed against the pillow, she could hear the blood pumping all the way down to her feet. It sounded something like the ocean, which she had seen once with Angel in Mexico. The baby nudged and poked at her with what felt like fingers, but must be tiny elbows or feet. She thought about the baby playing in waves of her blood on the smooth, dark beach of her insides. Her feet hurt, and she couldn't find a comfortable place in the bed. Finally, late in the night, she cried until her eye sockets felt empty. At the beach she had gotten seawater in her eyes, and they felt like this. Angel had warned her to keep them shut, but she had wanted to see where she was going. You never knew what kind of thing could be down there under the water.